Thanks everyone for coming to this workshop, and I want to thank my co-organizers, Josh, Olivia, and Alex. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk a bit about some modeling evolutionary game dynamics, thinking about cross-scale population or population interactions. And so generally speaking, I like thinking about the evolution of cooperative behavior, and it proposes this nice setup of the difference between the individual incentive to cheat and the collective incentive to cooperate. So why should we be cooperating when we're thinking about evolution and survival of the fittest? And so as a nice first example of conflict about cooperation, I like to think about two-player, two-strategy games where we can either cooperate or defect. We've seen these matrices before, but I'm going to use possibly some different letters. So two cooperators receive a reward for mutual cooperation. Two defectors receive a punishment for mutual defection. But when a cooperator and a defector interact, the defector gets a high payoff, a temptation to defect, while the cooperator gets a low payoff, the so-called sucker's payoff for cooperating with a defector. And we can put lots of different rankings on these payoffs to determine what the incentives for individuals are. We've seen some examples today. And so a particularly strict social dilemma, sometimes referred to as the prisoner's dilemma, arises when we have the temptation exceeds the reward, exceeds the punishment, exceeds the sucker payoff. So regardless of what your opponent does, you want to defect, but the two cooperators receive a better payoff than the two defectors, setting a little bit of a tension between the what's good for the individuals and what's good for the pair of individuals together. And so that's actually, so far, we've just talked about classical game theory. And so that was set forth by von Neumann and Morgenstern. So I was luckily, or fun to take a picture of von Neumann drive by the IIS at Princeton, and then Oscar Morgenstern plots, which is by the math and economics departments at the University of Vienna. And Vienna has a lot of connection to evolutionary game theory, as we talked about Hofbauer and Zygmunt, the evolutionary games and population dynamics. And I also was able to do some fun evolutionary game theory in a coffee shop in Vienna. Uh, and so with, I've often liked thinking about multi-level selection or thinking about evolutionary dynamics where there's possibly conflicts between what's favored at different levels of selection. And so evolutionary dynamics with multiple levels of selection goes all the way from thinking about things like, the origins of multicellularity to the establishment of, cooperation in complex animal and human societies. And often there is this conflict between an individual incentive to cheat and a collective incentive to cooperate. And so actually one participant here, Carl Veller, now at the University of Chicago, he first pointed me to these questions of multi-level selection, thinking about the cooperative founding of ant colonies and the conflicts between ant queens to sort of establish a colony versus the collective incentive for them to cooperate. But these things also, these conflicts can arise in things like the evolution of infectious disease or viruses, where the individual advantages of fast replication might be good for spreading within an individual host, but a slower replicating virus may be better at spreading between hosts. And so there's this really fun nested modeling paper describing the different levels of selection studied by Gilchrist and Coombs. And I found Coombs particularly easy to follow, easy to find on the programs for math bio conferences. And there was this really great framework introduced by Shishi Lo and Jonathan Mattingly for describing evolutionary dynamics at multiple levels. And so they think about group-structured populations where we have blue, here are, say, our cooperators, and red are our defectors. And they have, within each of the groups, there's an individual level birth-death process. So here in this group on the left, the defector is reproducing. And to keep things simple, we have a finite or fixed population size. A cooperator is choosing to die, and so the group goes from two cooperators, one defector, now to having two defectors, one cooperator. And the really neat aspect of their framework is they also consider group level competition as a birth and death process at the level of groups. So here in this group over here makes a copy of itself, and we replace one group in the population. And so one of our new groups has the same composition as this old group. And so I should say, in some applications, if we're thinking about cells, like cell division or things like this, you might think that this is a reasonable model of, or is somewhat, groups making a copy of themselves is somewhat accurate in sort of some of these proto-cell settings. And in other settings, like in the social animal groups, we might think more about groups growing and splitting. But this exact copy is really guided for analytical tractability. And so it's what we'll take as our baseline. And so Lowe and Mattingly originally had sort of a constant individual level selection aspect in their model. And so what Carl actually suggested to me was thinking about games being played within the groups, and that the individual and group competition arises from individual payoffs within your groups, and then the average payoffs of groups in a population. And so when we have these individuals playing a game within a group, if your group has X fraction cooperators and 1 minus X fraction defectors, we get that cooperators X fraction of the time face other cooperators, get a reward, and 1 minus X fraction of the time they face defectors and get the sucker payoff. You can similarly calculate the payoff that defectors get, and for that strict social dilemma where we have T greater than R and P greater than S, we actually have that the defectors always have a better payoff in the population, and so we expect them to win if we only have reproduction based on individual level payoff. And we'll hear a lot about different mechanisms that can help promote the individual success of cooperation through different forms of reciprocity or assortment and things like that throughout the week. But with these group models, we can also think about what is the average payoff of a group containing X cooperators, and what kind of groups would be the best kinds of groups in terms of maximizing collective payoff. And so here we have this average payoff of an X cooperator group has this nice quadratic polynomial in the fraction of cooperators. And so it is sometimes maximized by 100% cooperation. It's maximized by 100% cooperation when 2 times the reward is greater than or equal to the temptation payoff plus the sucker payoff. So that means when 2 cooperators interact, the total payoff they generate is greater than or equal to the total payoff generated by an interaction between a cooperator and a defector. But if it's the case that a cooperator and a defector actually generate more collective payoff, this could occur because the temptation to defect is really high, or the sucker payoff for cooperating with a defector is not that bad. It can turn out that there can be intermediate levels of cooperation that optimize the average payoff of groups. And so we can think, if we're having competition between groups based on the average payoff of groups, we might have a different tug of war between what the collective level of cooperation we want, depending on the entries of the matrix. And so we'll keep that in mind as we consider the tension between these two levels. And so going back to the Lowe and Mattingly framework, and I think also in the title of this talk, those cartoons of individual and group level replication are formulated as individual-based models. We have stochastic processes of rates of reproduction at the individual and group level. But it turns out that it's very nice in the limit where you have infinitely many groups and you have infinite group size. We can just describe our population by a probability density. So of our groups, we have a probability density of groups having X fraction of cooperators. So we describe all the compositions of all the groups. And we see that following those rules of individual-based replication based on your individual payoff, and then this group level replication process proportional to the group's average payoff, we get this partial differential equation describing the selection at each level. And so the individual level dynamics, we see that within this advection term, we have x1 minus x and the difference in payoffs. This is the replicator equation for individual level competition. And so this first term basically says that within groups, the type of strategy that's increasing in frequency is whichever one gives you a better payoff. And so for the prisoner's dilemma, the defectors are winning out within groups. But then at the group level, we have this second term that says that the density of X cooperator groups will increase when the average payoff of an X cooperator group is greater than the average payoff of the population. And so this is actually another way of thinking about replicator dynamics. This is replicator dynamics for groups. So groups that are doing better than average, that composition increases in frequency, but within groups, whatever payoff is doing better than average will increase in frequency within groups. And so this is kind of a nested or replicator equation within a replicator equation, if you want to think of it that way. And then this parameter lambda can arise from the individual level strengths, or the strengths of selection at the individual and group levels, and the relative rate of selection at those levels, where when lambda is small, we expect possibly the cheaters to win or the individual dynamics to win out. And then we can say, as we increase the strength of group level competition, as lambda gets bigger, we can ask, can we get the optimal, first, can cooperation survive under this model with a prisoner's dilemma? And then also what happens when lambda gets really big? Can we achieve the optimal outcome for a group? And with this PDE, we can use some numerical simulations. So starting from a yellow sort of uniform distribution, all group types equally likely, and lambda low, as we go from yellow to blue, time is progressing. As we get more blue with the color, we see that basically all the groups are piling up all at the all defector equilibrium. So the defectors win when we have small competition between groups or very weak competition between groups relative to individual selection. But from that same uniform initial condition, we see that when lambda is larger, we actually settle on towards a steady state density supporting positive levels of cooperation. And so this group level competition seems like it can support cooperation. And so it might be nice to study analytical properties of solutions of the PDE and the long time behavior. And it turns out it's kind of a mess, but we can parameterize steady states. We can get expressions for steady states and parameterize them in terms of a quantity known as the Helder exponent near the all cooperator group. And basically, in terms of this sort of tail behavior, which basically tells us how many groups are close to the all cooperator composition, it turns out that these steady states will be legitimate probability densities that cooperation can be sustained in a long time steady state if the competition between groups is greater than this threshold quantity that depends on this Helder exponent constant, but also the individual advantage of being a cheater. Basically, the average payoff defectors get when there's 100% cooperation minus what the cooperators get in a 100% cooperator group. But then in the denominator, we have the collective payoff of an all cooperator group versus the collective payoff of an all defector group. So it's the ratio of the individual incentive to cheat versus over the collective incentive to maintain cooperation. And for thinking about this is also sort of, you can think of it as sort of a tug of war between the equilibria of our model. The all cooperator equilibrium is unstable, the all defector equilibrium is stable under the individual dynamics, but the group level success of that unstable being groups close to that unstable equilibrium can allow cooperation to survive. And it turns out we can actually show that if our initial population has this Helder exponent with that property and lambda exceeds the threshold, then we converge to the steady state that has that property. So the Helder exponent is kind of a conserved quantity for the dynamics. And so if we look at these long time steady states are achieved in the situation where we want as much cooperation as possible, g of x is maximized at 1, we see that as we increase lambda, see these are all steady states for the same initial conditions, we see that as we increase lambda, we get lots and lots of cooperation, and it turns out we actually get as much cooperation as we like when we have really strong competition between groups. So in this case, we get the optimal outcome. What's best for the group is achieved when we have a really strong competition between groups. And we see something really different when groups are best off with, say, 75% cooperation, some intermediate level of cooperation. These are similarly all steady states, same initial condition, and we're increasing lambda, and we see that the steady states are piling up at a level of cooperation that's much less than the optimal level. And so when groups are best off with less than 100% cooperation, there ends up being this gap between how much cooperation we can actually get, even in the limit of infinitely strong group level competition. And so this is sometimes in terminology when people use the term multi-level selection or group selection. In this model, we have group and individual selection, and the limit of our multi-level selection model doesn't give the outcome of sort of the group selection, what's best for the group. And so there's really this intrinsic kind of tug of war at the individual level that's really hard to get rid of, even when we have really strong group competition. And this is more just on the PDE model, that there's actually lots of cool behaviors that we can have long time oscillations depending on if the behavior of the initial conditions, and we can come up with other thresholds that depend on sort of a generalization of the Helder exponent, where if lambda is less than that threshold, the population converges to a delta function at all defectors. The cheaters basically win. Whereas when lambda is bigger than that threshold, the population will survive, even though it might oscillate. There'll be a positive level of cooperation for an infinite sequence of times. And that gap from some of these bounds we can get on the long-term collective outcome, we can actually show that there's a lot of averages here. G is the average payoff of our groups. The angle bracket is averaged across the population, so the collective outcome of the population averaged in time, that ends up being less than or equal to the all cooperator outcome when we have really strong competition between groups. So that place where we were concentrating that was less than the optimum actually was the place that achieves the same payoff as the all cooperator group. And so we're basically limited that we can't do better than the all cooperator group. And the reason for this arises between that tug of war between the individual level equilibria. And so it turns out that we can't achieve this optimal outcome in the case of intermediate. When intermediate levels of cooperation are optimal, we can't actually achieve those outcomes. And I liked calling this the ghost of lower level selection, that somehow the individual dynamics is haunting the tug of war. But a peer reviewer said, we'll call it this, it says it's cast a long shadow, and maybe that was a better term. So that's the one that I like saying, that there's fundamentally, we can't lose we can't lose this effect of the individual level advantage, even when we have strong competition between groups. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some work Josh and I and some collaborators, or Josh and I worked on with some collaborators on thinking about how other within group mechanisms or individual level mechanisms of for promoting cooperation, like assortment, reciprocity, that we'll hear about more this week, can interact with multi-level selection. So you have the within group mechanism working and sort of group level competition. And so it turns out you can characterize what's the effect of all of these different mechanisms on both the individual level incentive to cheat, this pi d1 minus pi c1. So many of these mechanisms, assortment, or being assorted, more likely to cooperators more likely to interact with cooperators, or punishing defectors, rewarding cooperators. These sorts of things decrease the individual incentive to cheat. Many of them actually have no effect on the collective incentive to cooperate, because if a group's already all cooperators, assorting them won't create more interactions with cooperators. And some of them shift around that optimal group composition, moving us from the intermediate optimum to the edge optimum, and some don't. And it turns out that many of them kind of work like in concert with multi-level selection, that we have sort of, these mechanisms decrease, in the case of the donation game, the benefit to cost ratios that we sometimes talk about, the payoff matrix in terms of you pay a cost C to confer a benefit B to your opponent if you're a cooperator. It turns out that basically most of these mechanisms, adding multi-level selection decreases the benefit to cost ratio needed to promote cooperation, and adding the mechanism of the within group mechanism decreases the lambda, the group level selection needed to promote cooperation. But there are some cases with graph structured populations, so playing games on a k-regular graph with either death, birth, or imitation updating, where actually adding the graph structure can make it harder to achieve cooperation by multi-level selection, or that the graph types that help promote cooperation at the individual level are not the same graphs that help promote cooperation by multi-level selection. And so there's a lot of interesting questions of how the individual mechanisms shaping this tug of war also interact with group level competition. And then I guess going back to Low and Mattingly, and then the models I considered, was always assuming individuals and groups reproduce at a rate depending on their payoff, and then we randomly pick someone to die. But it could be that this competition could be due to this differential proliferation or differential extinction. You could have a selective death event paired with a random birth. And so there's all these different update rules. I really like the terminology of, you say what happens first, then what happens second, and then the capital letter says what's selective. Everything I've talked about is this birth death, where we have a group reproduce, select based on their payoff, and then pick a random group to die. But you could have a random death followed by groups having kind of a lottery based on their payoff to pick who gets to reproduce. And you can also do events where the selective event follows a death. And so for this death, lowercase d, capital B, death birth case, we have all groups dying at some fixed rate, capital lambda, but then groups compete to reproduce based on some fecundity function, depending on their composition. And so it turns out you get a PDE with a different form that kind of, as we've seen, looks a little like the death birth probabilities may have seen from a Moran process or something like this for individual selection. But an interesting feature is that there's kind of a greater degree of nonlinearity in this model, because the birth rate, like the rate at which X cooperator groups get reproduced, depends on both the composition of X cooperative groups and the success of the whole population. And so there's some tricky things that show up in those PDEs. And so it turns out it's possible to analyze these as well and use some of these ideas about extinction and persistence that don't tend to show up in when we deal with the sort of the previous model. And so there's a lot to study about these different forms of selection and how they impact the long-time behavior and even how they interact with those other mechanisms. And it turns out there's lots of other cool things we can talk about, such as modeling the evolution of early cells or protocells, where the individuals are genes and the groups are cells. And it turns out if we want two cells to coexist, even though they're competing, or two genes to coexist, it's kind of like that shadow problem that we have an intermediate optimum and one's competing with the other. So linking competing genes into sort of baby chromosomes can help overcome that shadow. And so that's kind of a fun way to think about the evolution of the linkage of genes and sort of these evolution of early cells. But also there's lots of interesting mathematical questions about alternative scaling limits. I was always assuming sort of a strong selection at both levels, but under weak selection, we can have PDEs with like Kimura type diffusion terms, or we can even have stochastic limits. And there's also some cool applications we can think of like related to models of cultural evolution, sort of Richardson-Boyd kind of cultural multi-level selection sorts of models. So I wanted to thank my co-authors on these projects and as well as Carl for all the discussions about this stuff. And yeah, I wanted to thank you all for joining our meeting. And yeah, here are some really fun papers that I've enjoyed on multi-level selection. Particularly recommend the papers by Lowe and Mattingly that really set this forward. I think Lowe's 2014 paper really is one of my favorite papers I've ever read illustrating this framework. And here's some papers. The long-term behavior stuff is this work with Yoichiro Mori, and there's some fun models applying these things to these like protocell and chromosome kind of models, and also the within group mechanisms and different models of sort of cultural multi-level selection with pairwise competition between groups. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to discuss any fun things we can do, thinking about how these sorts of mechanisms can interact with different things that we've been thinking about in the evolutionary game theory context. So thanks so much.